Hey everybody, this week I'm going to show you how we're going to do our very own Eric Carle inspired collages. So there's just a few things that you're going to need to use in order to do this. It's pretty simple, but we're going to do a little bit of painting first, and then we'll do some cutting and gluing in the second half of this project. So in order to get started, what you're going to need some paper towels. You're going to need probably a dish of water in order to rinse your brush. You're going to need all of your paints. Maybe a paper plate or another plastic lid to use as your palette. You're going to need and then some other like household items that you can find around the house. Things like plastic forks, sponges, scraper tools, anything that you can find that will help make a mark in some kind of creative, unique way will be really useful. So gather all those things and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, now that you've got all of your materials ready, I want you to grab one of those nice sturdy pieces of white paper, 9x12, out of your project folder. And so what we're going to do, we're just going to go ahead and get some of our paints out, and I want you to do just a basic coat of any color that you want. You know, you can start with a primary color, you can mix a couple colors together in order to get a secondary, but basically we're going to coat each of our sheets of paper. I picked out 4 to begin with, and in fact, I actually ended up using 5 in this project. So use as many as you think you need. It's going to correlate to the kinds of colors and things that you're thinking about using in your project, but we'll get to that during the second half. Right now, what you can do is just kind of get your palette prepared. You can squeeze out all of the paints that you think you'll need, and you can get to mixing and just brushing on with probably your biggest brush out of the packet. Just a basic flat wash of color. So now that I've got my whole sheet of paper colored with just a nice yellow, I decided I wanted to maybe put in some orange streaks. That's kind of something that you saw in the Eric Carle video, I hope, is that he adds some interesting textures and variety. It's not just a flat sheet of color, that there's going to be some other elements that help bring some texture, some pattern, some rhythm, just some basic fun kind of patterns and things that we can add to our paper. So you can see here I mixed together a little bit of an orange, and I'm just, painting in some streaks here. I'm going to go in a little bit thicker here in a minute, and you'll see how this sheet of paper progresses. As I keep mixing in wet paint into wet paint, you can get kind of a softer effect. If you wait for your paint on your paper to dry first, you'll notice that you get these nice hard edges and nice hard brush strokes instead of these soft ones that kind of blend out. Okay, now I have some streaks in there. You can see that I grabbed my sponge, just a kind of a basic kitchen sponge, and I got some dabs of that orange paint, and I'm just kind of going through and giving it a little bit of a spongier texture. It's a little tough to see on the video, but if you could see my paper in person, you would see that there's like a real kind of like rough texture starting to take hold on the surface of the paper. And here you can see I'm doing the same thing with my sponge, but just with some white paint. I thought it could use a little bit kind of a lighter value. I had something in mind for what I might end up using this piece of paper for, but we'll see that in the second half. But right now, I'm just kind of getting an interesting texture onto that flat yellow and now orange sheet of paper. So once I felt like I was pretty well finished with that, I wanted to set it aside to dry, and I grabbed another sheet of paper. You can see here that I started washing my brush. I wanted to make sure I got all that pigment out of there because I was going to start with a new color that I didn't think yellow would work really well in. So I noticed that my palette got a little bit messy, my paper plate that is, and so I went to go grab another one. After grabbing my new paper plate, I kind of realized maybe the next color I would use and try and create would be a green. So we mixed green before for our dinosaur project, and we can remember that's mixing the primary colors of yellow and blue, but it was still a good idea to brush your paint in between colors and kind of get all the extra pigments kind of mixed out. So remember, a lot of yellow and a little bit of blue goes a long way, and that starts to get you a really basic green. So I started to do the same thing that I did with my first sheet of paper. I just started to mix up my color, and then I tried to paint over the entire surface. It's okay if it looks a little bit streaky, if some of the white of the paper shows through. That just adds a little bit of texture and visual interest. Here I decided that it just wasn't dark enough of a green, so I'm even like mixing in just some straight blue on top of that. And at a distance, our eye will blend those things together and it'll look a little bit more green. But up close, if you were to look at this sheet of paper, you would see that there's a lot of like distinct blue streaks. But I'm going to do my best to kind of blend them out anyway, but also retain some kind of streakiness, some nice texture on this sheet of paper as well. Now here's the fun part. I grabbed a plastic fork from my kitchen kind of cabinet, and I'm dragging the prongs of it through the paint, which is still wet, and it allows me to create kind of an interesting effect. So you can try different approaches for using tools like this. You can just kind of improvise. Here I found it made really neat marks when I kind of pressed the back end of it down against the paper and gave it little pulls and dabs and taps. From here on out, I just tried a few different varieties. I put a couple more layers on each of my sheets of paper. I tried things like adding spots. I didn't love the way that those looked, but you might find a way to make it work. And I just kind of kept doing the same thing over and over until I was happy with my results. Once I got through painting all of my 4 original sheets of paper, I gave them some time to dry, and I came back and I thought I would do some final touches. So again, I just gave another pass. I tried to add some contrasting colors. I tried to add some analogous colors, colors that would fall next to each other on the color wheel. And I just tried to make them interesting in their pattern and their texture. Here's another fun tool that I found useful just around my house, was an old toothbrush, and I found that I could do a couple different things. I could run my fingers along the bristles and give it like a nice fine misty spray, or I could get a lot of paint kind of dabbed onto the end and just flick it towards my paper, and that gave me kind of like an ink splot sort of effect. So again, you can just experiment with things that you think might be interesting, might make interesting marks. I could think of the effect of a feather maybe, or a piece of yarn, or basically anything that you could think of or dig out of your junk drawer. So that's pretty much how it went. You'll see this unfold, but I kept going back and adding more layers. I kept adjusting my paintings. I kept running things through them to create texture, to scratch off parts of the paint. And I just kind of kept at that until I was ready to let them dry. So I let those sheets of paper dry for a couple hours, and actually in looking at it, I decided I wanted a 5th one. I didn't like the way that my bluish and purple one turned out, but I thought I could use that for extra bits, but I wanted one that was a little bit more what I had planned, because by now I'd come up with an idea for my drawing that I wanted to do. So what you'll need is your paper. You'll need this piece of cardboard. It's 8x10, should be in your folder. You will need your glue, which is just Elmer's glue in a little bottle. You can see that it's written glue on that one. It's not your white paint. You'll need your scissors that we included in your art kit. And also, as you can see here, is my drawing. While it was drying, I spent a little bit of time coming up with just a really simple sort of composition. And so you can see my motif of my owl is here. You can see sort of he's sitting on a branch and there's a moon behind him, but I've just drawn it out in simple shapes. I've also numbered, for my own purposes, kind of in what order they'll need to go on, because we're going to be cutting some of these out of our sheets of paper that we just painted and needing to layer them in the proper way. So we'll go ahead and we'll get started. What I think I needed to do first was do the background piece, and I knew that that was going to cover just the whole sheet of cardboard. So here I knew I wanted to use this piece for my background. What I did was just flipped it over. I took my cardboard and just placed it flat down there, and had to run to go get a pencil. And once I had one, I was ready to go just trace around the borders, just to make sure that I was, drawing it at the right size. And so what I would do then is take my scissors and just cut it out. The next thing that I needed to do was just go ahead and grab my glue and start putting some down. And so I took the background, our mounting piece of the cardboard, and you can see here I'm just using tiny little dots. With glue, you do not need a lot. In fact, I like to say with kids, 1 dot is a lot. But I'm putting them throughout the plane. You know, it's not a big gloopy mess. We want to have students avoid that kind of stuff. And then I could just place my cut to size piece of paper down, kind of use my hands to smooth over it a little bit. And in fact, I also decided it would be useful if it didn't quite want to hold, so I wanted to press down really nice and hard. I also then turned it over and pressed down that way, just to make sure that it wasn't shifting in place. The next thing that I did was grab the drawing that I made. You can see that I made a couple copies. I just did this by scanning it into my printer and printing it back out. And what I'm doing here is I'm just cutting out kind of the branch that the owl sits on and the owl itself. I thought by doing this, I could isolate some of those shapes that I made out, and I could use this as sort of a template for tracing those shapes onto the pieces of paper that we've painted. Then I decided that the first piece I really needed to put in here in terms of the layers that I was thinking of is the moon that was going to be in the background, right? And so I grabbed that sheet of paper, my drawing, and then I cut out just the little bit of the moon that we could see peeking out from behind the owl. What I did then was I grabbed this nice orange yellow sheet of paper that I had. I thought that would make a good color for the moon, and I flipped it over. So remember, if you do this, that the shape is going to turn out backwards. So I did this just because it would keep any like kind of dirty pencil marks off of such a light color. But you'll need to remember, typically you'll see later what I do is I draw on the front side of the sheet of paper. You can see here, I'm just taking my pencil and I'm tracing around the edges of that circle that I have. And that gives me enough of a beginning to be able to kind of guess what the rest of that shape will be. I know it's a nice regular circle, and so easily with my pencil, I'm just able to sketch it in. So you need to think about how you're going to do this, as various shapes will overlap, and you'll need to fill in gaps like this along the way. But hopefully this makes sense to you seeing this example. And then it was time to repeat the process. I cut out the shape here for the moon. I then used tiny dots of glue to glue it down, and I did that for every single shape that I'd counted on my drawing. In total, I had 13 shapes. You might end up with less. Part of the fun thing about the Eric Carle style is that it's really simple, right? If you think of the Very Hungry Caterpillar, there's only just maybe, a few varieties of shapes, a lot of ovals. There's a few things, added for antenna, I think, or whatever, but it is working really simple. And so that's part of the reason why at the beginning of the semester I had you draw your motif using simple shapes. So go back to that idea. You can draw on that original drawing if you want, but you want to make sure that you're adding in some kind of background. Just like I have the moon here, we don't want your motif just floating in space. So pay attention to that. We'll just go ahead and see kind of how mine unfolds here, because I just kept at it. I cut out each piece. I traced it, and then I cut it out, glued it down, and I had to think a little bit about kind of the ordering of these things. So let's just see how it unfolds. Okay, so there it is. That's pretty much my final product. But what I decided, I needed that little black at the center of the owl's eye. So I just went and grabbed a Sharpie. You're free to use a Sharpie marker or anything else to add little embellishments like this, but you don't want to go over the top. You want to let that simple collage style kind of sit for itself. So there you saw I put in, the pupils of the eyes. I just made them a little bit bigger, and I'm pretty happy with my results. So I hope that this has been informative. If you have any questions about this process, please don't hesitate to ask. But otherwise, I hope you have fun.